Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my Wednesday lunch break series. My name is Dr. Michael Ventrice. I'm a meteorological scientist at the Weather Company, which is part of IBM. To be clear, this Twitch stream that you guys are viewing does not reflect my employer, but it's meant for educational purposes. It's meant for us to kind of share information about what's going on in weather, and we're specifically going to be focusing on the hurricane season in the tropics. We just had a major landfalling hurricane, Category 4 major hurricane Laura, landfall across parts of across the Gulf states and impact Louisiana. And we're watching two new systems that were just recently developed yesterday and named as tropical storms over the Atlantic Basin: Tropical Storm Nana and Tropical Storm Omar, which essentially was the fastest to name the N and O storm in our history. So it's going to be an interesting season, guys. So I do want to say, for folks who are new to the stream, if you want to ask any questions that we're going to get to at the end here, you have to follow me on Twitch, and that way you can have access to the chat, okay? I do want to shout out to all the subscribers that have been subscribing. Thanks so much, guys. I appreciate it. It's been an interesting experience here doing these live streams. Still trying to figure this out. Still trying to understand the whole thing, but we're making progress here. So I have a very special guest today, and I'm excited to bring this guest on here. I've asked my good friend Dr. Phil Klotzbach to join the stream today, and Phil and I have known each other for a number of years. I think I met Phil back in, it might have been 2010 at the AMS Tropical Storms Conference. I remember, when I was writing my dissertation, I did a lot of, obviously tropical hurricane activity of the Atlantic, and this is Phil's wheelhouse. And I remember reading a lot of his papers when I was writing my dissertation. And Phil, when I first saw Phil, I was like, wait, that's Dr. Klotzbach? There's no way that's Dr. Klotzbach. That man looks like he's an undergraduate. Well, somehow Phil has discovered the fountain of youth, because he is a very young-looking man. So let me give a little background about Phil here. He is a research scientist for the Department of Atmospheric Science at Colorado State University, where he received, I think, both his master's and his PhD there. He received his PhD in 2007, and now he's been employed by CSU for the past 20 years, I think. I was doing some research on Phil. I think he has around 90 peer-reviewed articles, which is a very significant accomplishment in the field of meteorology and research. He worked under the very famous Dr. Bill Gray through 2005, where Dr. Gray did a lot of work on hurricane activity, and he pretty much provided these seasonal outlooks of activity, and Phil took that over in 2006, where he's been doing this ever since. He recently started, I think over the last 9 or 10 years, he started looking at a couple, what's going to happen the next few weeks of activity. So he calls them these 2-week forecasts. Luckily today, Phil has, he actually issued one of these reports today. And, we're going to talk about all this stuff. So we're going to talk with Phil here. I'm going to bring Phil on the stream here. If I click this guest speaker button here we go. Still working out the kinks. Phil, you are on the screen, man. How are you doing today? Thanks for joining, bud.
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. It's been a busy day, trying to get a lot of stuff done as normal, trying to pay attention to the tropics. We have 2 new storms out there, Nana and Omar, which I think a lot of the tropical community is pretty much not really paying attention to, as both storms aren't really a threat for the U.S. mainland. But I know Nana is probably, we're watching that for a potential intensification to a hurricane over and potentially impact Belize, but still a little bit unclear on that. There's some issues there with intensity forecasts, as there always is. So, thanks for joining. And I did an introduction there, and I think I unmuted myself.
Yes, I heard you.
Great.
Thank you.
I appreciate that, and hopefully the stream is not unmuted, but I don't see the chat yelling at me that's saying it's muted like they normally do. So, but you just released your forecast today for the next 2 weeks, and you're in charge of doing these seasonal outlooks, and your Colorado State University forecast for the hurricane season back a number of months ago was for a very active year. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we put out ours in April. I think You guys put yours out in, is it May? I can't remember when your first one, or is it April?
I think it's around the same time where the weather company does issue seasonal forecasts as well. That's always done by our seasonal forecaster, Dr. Todd Crawford. But it's around the same time.
Okay, yeah. So, and I think I'm pretty sure that theirs is pretty similar. Like, yeah, I mean, it looked like all things considered, it looked like a pretty active season in April, and then conditions in general have trended generally somewhat more favorable. It's been a really interesting season so far, as I'm sure we'll dive in and talk a lot more about that. But obviously, if you're looking at sheer number of storms this year, is, you know, we're I think as of September 2nd, we're 3 storms ahead of any other year. So from a named storm perspective, it's giving gangbusters. But from an accumulated cyclone energy index, which is what I love to use, and a lot of people do too, it's Laura was by far the most impactful storm of the year. I'm sure everyone remembers Laura. We've had 3 hurricanes hit the U.S., but a lot of the storms in general have been fairly weak and short-lived. So even say if Nana does reach hurricane strength, we're going to have had potentially 5 hurricanes, but they will have lasted all told about 6 days. So they've generally been fairly short-lived hurricanes, although obviously Laura was incredibly impactful, even though she wasn't a hurricane for all that long.
Yeah, Laura we went through that rapid intensification, which brought that storm up to a major in just hours. And so people who aren't familiar with the concept of ACE, this is an accumulated cyclone energy, where essentially it is a metric to quantify long-living hurricanes. Essentially, the long-living hurricanes are weighted more so than these storms that spin up very quickly or may not exist for a long period of time, and that'll impact this quantity, which we call ACE. And that's where Phil likes to kind of measure his activity in the season.
Correct. So if we're looking at a baseball analogy, if you're looking at someone's Hall of Fame credentials, you want to look and see like how do they do over the long haul, as opposed to like just blowing up overnight and having 1 or 2 really good years. So kind of using that baseball analogy, that's what we use with hurricanes too. So a hurricane like Irma, which was extremely long-lived, seemed like it was out there for about 2 weeks, long-lived major hurricane, generated as much ACE as like 20 different hurricane seasons. So just that one storm. So these long-lived major hurricanes. And kind of the most classic example I always give is 2004 versus 2005. Both of those years very impactful. Both of those years had similar ACE levels. 2005 had 28 storms. 2004 had 15. So, but they did it about the same level of ACE, because we had a storm like Ivan in 2004 that generated like 70 ACE points by itself, and an average season's like 100. So You can get these individual storms that generate tremendous amounts of ACE, but if they're short-lived, even a storm like Laura that got really strong, they can only generate so much ACE if they're only out there for a few days. Same with Katrina in 2005. Obviously incredibly strong, very intense, but didn't generate a ton of ACE just because it wasn't out there for all that long.
So part of your seasonal outlooks, you provide the number of named storms, the number of named storm days, hurricanes, et cetera, and you also provide this ACE metric. So for your particular forecast for this season right now, as of August 5th, I believe I'm looking at, you had a total of 24 named storms, which our average is what, around 12?
Yeah, and that average is a little thin given the more recent years with microwave sensors and all this stuff. We're definitely naming more of these weak, short-lived storms. So probably the long-term average now is more like 14 or 15, but you know, if I had to issue a new forecast today, I'd probably actually up the number of storms, because we're already sitting at 15. And looking at the model guidance, we could very well have 3 or 4 more in the next 10 days. So I think the number of storms is certainly going to verify. Some of those other quantities, it might not. It's hard to say. It's really, it's really tricky this time of year, because I'm sure we'll talk about this more too, but like the global models have just generally done a really crappy job of forecasting hurricane development in the Atlantic. So they're not giving a lot of definitely stuff. Something's going to form in the next few days, but exactly what, and if it's 3 or 4 week storms or 1 or 2 longer lived storms, the models have a hard time figuring that out. And just to show how bad, basically the models this year have been really bad. Like if you look back, say 48 hours ago, and look, they didn't have Nana, they didn't have Omar. 5 days before Laura was a Cat 4 bearing down on the Gulf of Mexico, neither GFS or ECW had anything in the Northern Gulf. So there hasn't been a lot of good. The models have been good for forecasting a large scale, but in terms of forecasting individual TCs, they haven't been very good. So it's always, and that's something to be cautious with anyway, especially when you're looking for tropical cyclone genesis. Models don't always do a great job, which is why when when I do subseasonal forecasts and you guys do subseasonal forecasts, you talk about the large scale of what it's looking like. You don't just necessarily say, hey, the model's spitting up X number of storms.
It's been
we have to use our meteorological knowledge to figure this stuff out.
It's been an interesting problem this year, right? The amount of times that I heard, the hour 240 plus from the GFS shows no storms at all over the basin. Like, why are the models so bad this year? It's been interesting. I know that with regards to, Nana and Omar, right? Nana had such a small little eye feature, the core of winds there, that the only way we'd have realized that was actually as robust as it was because we had a recon aircraft go through and measure that, highlighting the importance of getting these recon planes into the developing storms. But I mean, Omar had convection for it maybe a 12-hour period before it decoupled, and the shear just kind of drove it apart. So it's really tough for these models to get these types of these processes and interactions, and when it comes to a matter of hours compared to days. That being said, we nailed it on the head with Laura. We would hope that the models would show some sort of Category 4 hurricane. I mean, I'm not even just a Category 4, but at least some kind of, robust pressure system over the Gulf of Mexico tracking to the U.S. Something like that. And I know that the GFS and the ECMWF both struggled with that. But I know that there were some other models. The UK Met model did a pretty good job of highlighting risk there. So it's interesting that these issues seem to be correlated with particular models, and there's biases. And I think with Laura, there was interactions with potential land there that was causing problems. Anyway, it was a whole laundry list that are
and they struggle with Marco too. It's been interesting. Like, they just in general haven't done. Yeah, it's just in general hasn't, like you said. I mean, if you step back, I think it was like 3 or 4 days, before Marco and Laura, there was just nothing there. And so it's important to realize. And if you just look one, I mean, I pay way too much attention to the models looking at stuff. And it's like, you go one model run to the next and there's all these big flip flops. And especially coming up, there's all sorts of waves coming off Africa. There's stuff already out there. And it's just going to all kind of glam up together and something's going to come out of it. But each model has its own rendition of what's coming out, and it's very interesting to see kind of what might be transpiring in the next couple of weeks. I mean, it could be 3 or 4 week storms. Some of the models show like maybe a couple of them kind of like merging together and forming more one robust system, and then whether it kind of recurves really far east or goes straight across. Because basically, if you're looking for ACE, or you're looking for a lot of strong hurricane, you got to get further west because the SSTs in the Eastern Atlantic aren't that warm. So if you got to tap the 29, 30 degrees Celsius water, you got to get farther west. So
which is the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So but it still kind of remains to be seen, what's going to actually transpire. But certainly, I think we're going to see some stuff in the next couple of weeks. But exactly what comes out of it is, it's really hard to know. And I have to admit, like, one of the things I was looking back at, and I still really mad at myself for not figuring out earlier, was we put out a forecast. Let me look and see. We put out a forecast in late August 2017, right before. So September 2017 was the most active September on record. Just absolutely insane. Obviously, most notable for Irma and Maria, and then also we had Jose, and then on. Let's see. Okay, yeah, but then let's see. Which one was it? Yeah. Oh, I guess we did forecast above average. Sorry, I thought we didn't. Oh, good. I'm glad we did. Okay, so it wasn't as bad as I thought. Well, good.
Always a good exercise to go back and verify things, right?
Yeah, I thought for some reason we hadn't picked up on it as well. Maybe it was the following year. I think it was 2018 when we had that big flurry in August, in late August, early September. We didn't pick up on that, and that was no good. Yeah, near normal. August 30th, 2018, we had that big flurry and just completely whiffed on it.
I suspect, typically when we see these types of like flurries and activity that the models miss, usually like 80% of the time we see some sort of like intraseasonal enhancement, right? We get a pretty robust Kelvin wave that comes through, or an MJO, Madden-Julian oscillation, that propagates across the basin. And the models have to resolve how that feature, that circulation in the tropics, then convectively triggers African easterly waves over Africa, how those easterly waves then grow barotropically and baroclinically against the easterly jet, and then how it moves across the Atlantic and interacts with the environment. There's a lot of variables there for these models to have to handle. So
yeah,
that you nailed it on the head when you said, as a subseasonal forecaster, we have to look at the large scale environment to understand how, to give a sense of what activity is coming. And it's hard to say
Yeah.
what particular storm or not, like you mentioned, we have the models are indicating a couple areas of low pressure over the eastern MDR that then merge. And the models seem to have a hard time with representing of those small scale features, which one becomes dominant and develop, right? So these are the things that we're dealing with, and it makes a headache for forecasters.
Yeah, and some of this stuff I'm not sure we're ever going to be able to forecast, because I think some of it's almost like, which vortex becomes more dominant. I mean, just if thunderstorms develop in a certain way, some of this stuff I'm not sure necessarily you can predict 4 or 5 days out. It may just be too small scale. But especially with Nana, I have to give the forecasters NHC credit, because the models in general didn't develop anything out of that, and the Hurricane Center was on it. They kept identifying it as something that should go. So I always like to look at the SHIPS model, which is a statistical model, but it basically it looks at a variety of large scale factors like sea surface temperatures, ocean heat content, vertical wind shear, relative humidity. Mm-hmm. And if those are relatively low, the waters are warm. Usually if the shear's low, the water's warm, the moisture's high, you're probably going to get a storm, whether the models say there's going to be a storm or not. And I know Bill Gray used to always just say, all you need is the 200 millibar streamlines. That's all you need. If you got upper level wind flow, you can figure out what's going to go and what's not going. So that was his way of forecasting. He beat the model sometimes with that approach. So
hey, you gotta love the old school type of forecasting. I mean, the guys that had to deal with trying to predict the weather before satellites were launched into space. You gotta give them props, right? So
exactly, yeah. And I think Bill Gray said that, I believe, as I think it was maybe an Air Force student wrote a master's thesis on the first satellite image, basically just the first ever satellite image, or the whole thesis on it, just because there was so much stuff that they kind of knew was there, but you hadn't seen it until you got satellites. So
do you kind of feel
spoiled now?
Do you feel a little lucky being involved with meteorology when we got involved? It's still it's a pretty new science, right? I mean, it's evolving. It's evolved over the last 10, 20 years significantly here with advances in numerical weather prediction and satellites. But like I always tell my friends and family, when I talk about getting a PhD in meteorology, I'm like, I'm lucky. I had something to study that wasn't yet studied before. Where you look at other fields that have been studied numerous times, and it's much more challenging to get something new. So I always we got in at a good time.
I agree. I mean, I think like when it comes to like chemistry or physics, some of these more these classical sciences, like getting into the cutting edge of the field, it takes a lot of time and effort. I think you can get to the cutting edge or you can look at questions that nobody's looked at in meteorology a lot sooner, because there's still so many questions. There's so many things we still don't understand, and we still have horrible busts on day-to-day weather forecasts, the seasonal, the sub-seasonal. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff, and but one thing I think with meteorology is if you forecast, you learn a tremendous amount by forecasting that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise learn. And I think when a forecast goes well, or when it doesn't, especially when the forecast doesn't go well, we learn a ton.
Right.
Because it's like, well, why did everything point this way and then the season go completely differently? And is there stuff that we can do to predict that? And we spent a lot of time trying to improve the models and trying to improve kind of also estimating the uncertainty in the forecast and stuff to try to basically, better be able to forecast. Because when you're doing like a seasonal forecast, obviously June 1st, we can't say, okay, a storm's going to form August 22nd, move off of Africa and track this direction. But what we try to do is basically say, okay, the large scale is likely to look a specific way. And if the large scale is more conducive, you tend to get more hurricanes. If it's less conducive, you get fewer hurricanes.
Right.
And so I think that's kind of more, that's where these seasonal forecasts work. So we come out with numbers, but it's more like, hey, the environment is, 20% more favorable than normal, we think, or 20% less favorable than normal. And then in general, you get fewer or more storms, but you can have, even if you know exactly what the shear's like, the water temperatures are like, even with perfect knowledge of the peak of the season, you can still get a varied range of outcomes. And NOAA emphasizes that. And we showed that in our paper on 2018, where 2018 was kind of a quote unquote overachieving season. You look at the large scale, it wasn't very conducive. The waters were cool, the shear was high, it was dry, and yet we still ended up with above normal activity. And so it's like, what happened? And so if you plot, that's even perfect, not even saying that the seasonal forecast, but just from perfect knowledge of the large scale, you would say we wouldn't have had as many storms. And if you just plot like shear versus ACE or hurricane numbers, are spread in that value. And that's trying to forecast on a seasonal time scale, or using monthly averages to forecast individual storms forming in individual places. Sometimes storms can find little pockets where the environment's good, or they can have a great environment and find the one little pocket where the environment isn't good. There's an upper level feature or something that shears it apart. And,
Synoptics
you look at a storm like, I always remember like looking at Florence. Like Florence was a Cat 4 and then got just sheared like crazy. And I swear if that thing had been there for like 3 more hours, Florence was gone.
Right.
But the system moved on and then it got back in and re-intensified to a Cat 4. And so you can't forecast that in a seasonal time scale, but that added probably 20 to 30 ACE units and made for obviously a very impactful U.S. landfall. So you watch these storms and you realize kind of like when you watch the stuff in real time, you realize how there's obviously a lot of noise in the seasonal forecast. And so, even with this year, we'll see how things transpire. But, our forecast of 24 storms, 12 hurricanes, and 5 major hurricanes, our most recent forecast, it's going to be really hard pressed to verify that now, just given to perfectly verify, unless basically every single storm that forms from here, we get very few additional formations that aren't hurricanes. Basically everything from here on out is exactly a hurricane. Right. Because we've had a ton of storms, but we're sitting at 4 hurricanes, maybe 5 if Nana goes. So it's hard to know exactly how the season is going to shake out. But, I think all in all, things still look like an active season, but probably not quite the exact numbers that we forecast. Probably even more storms that we forecast, but maybe not quite as many hurricanes. But we'll see.
I think you nailed it on the head in the sense that when you're talking about forecasting, right? When you're actually putting out a number, you have your skin in the game. That is the best way to learn about the weather, learn about what's going on, what drivers matter in a given year, because they change every year or they can be the same. It's tough to kind of diagnose those two at certain times. But if you're never going to put your numbers out there, you're not going to never make a forecast, and you sit there and you claim that something that you're researching is impacting it, but you never test it, you never really truly learn. And so I think as you are becoming, if anyone's watching on the stream that there's an aspiring meteorologist and you want to really become a leader in the industry and develop something to be useful, it's always good to get your skin in the game and see how those things that you're developing, your thesis, et cetera, how they play out, because it can vary, and that's where you learn the most, right? Why did this not work this time? I used to get questions all the time from some of the folks at the Hurricane Center saying, there's a good Kelvin wave coming through, and there's no storms. Like, why? What's going on? Like, what happened? And these are things that we need to figure out. So it's a great concept. And Phil, I think we can call you an academic guy, right? You're employed by an academic institution, but most folks in academia don't really put their skin in the game. So you're one of the rare few that's bridging that connection between providing public forecasts and being an academic source of that information. So, it's a rarity.
Yeah, well, that was always Bill Gray's thing. Bill Gray forecast everything, whether it was, if you looked at his whiteboard, he had forecasts of, so we always had forecasts, obviously the hurricane stuff, we'd forecast individual storms, how strong we thought they were going to be. We'd always forecast who was going to win various elections, forecast who's going to win, baseball, every sport, under the sun, always picked who win the Super Bowl, who win the World Series, all these different things. He was really big into forecasting. Always wanted and even when Bill Gray was dying, I went and visited him a few days before he died, and he was having every single doctor that would come in, he would ask them to give him a forecast of how much longer he had to live. That was just his total way. He was always like, how much longer do I have? 3 days, 7 days, 10 days. That was just his way. He always wanted to. It was always a forecast for everything. So, I personally I think you just learn a tremendous amount by forecasting. And one thing I think you pointed out that's good to realize too is that these seasonal predictors that we use, they may change with time too. You have natural variability in the climate system, you have climate change. And so what we use now may not be what we use for seasonal forecasts 20, 30 years from now. And if you look historically at how these climate parameters have correlated with hurricane numbers through time, they sometimes change and fairly considerably. And so some of that may be data issues with the observations or the observations at the large scale or the hurricanes. But Bill Gray always said, you don't just develop a statistical model and then put it on a shelf and run it for 30 years. These things change with time, and certainly our group at CSU, we've used certain predictors and then ditched them and brought in other predictors. And we try to make sure they're robust with time, but there's periods in time where forecasts don't work as well, especially anytime you look at periods around World War II. Every model basically falls apart, and so probably a lot of that's data issues in World War II. But we wrote a paper on the 1933 hurricane season, which was extremely active, had 2 major hurricane landfalls in the U.S. less than a day apart, and I'm going through the reviews on that paper now. And so there's questions about, the reviews, the model that you're using kind of fell apart in the 40s and 50s. Is that basically meaning that, that physical feature, like that it's not a good model? And I was like, well, in the 40s and 50s, you could correlate shear with hurricane number and get a correlation of 0. So does that mean that hurricanes were just completely random during that time? Probably not. It's probably the data is lousy. But there's a lot of those kinds of issues that we're always working on, is trying to kind of understand why the non-stationarity in the climate system. And again, you've got natural climate on decadal, multi-decadal cycles, climate change throwing a monkey wrench at things too. So definitely seasonal and subseasonal forecasting always going to keep us on our toes. And like you said, once you start going down from the seasonal time scale to like the MJO 30 to 60 day time scale, and you got the Kelvin wave time scale on all these waves, and everything interacts on all these different time scales, and it makes for challenging forecasts. So I'm really curious to see. I spend a decent amount of time with the 2-week forecast, but this one I agonized over for a really long time, because Mike and I had an email chat about this ahead of time, and there's a lot of funky things going on, and especially as you mentioned, there's a lot of the West Pacific typhoon season, which was completely dead, has suddenly blossomed, and you got some of these recurving typhoons, and that causes all sorts of issues with downstream predictability. The models stink usually right after that, and that can cause uncertainty as to once those ridges and troughs propagate downstream, that can impact on the Atlantic circulation. So lots of uncertainty, and it makes for interesting times.
Yeah, so let's keep on with that here and talk about this season right now, and then we'll get into your latest forecast here. So far, we have 15 named storms of your 24 predicted. So your prediction's looking good right now, I think.
Yeah.
Just for a number of storms. I know you said ACE could be a little bit different, but it looks like we're on par here so far. If there were anything that was surprising to you so far this season, what would that be?
I mean, I'm surprised we haven't seen more in the Eastern Atlantic. Yeah. I really thought we would have. We've had, everything's been pretty far west, and it's been interesting because the stuff that's formed has all 4, if Nana becomes a hurricane, it'd be 5. So far, all 4 hurricanes that have formed have come from kind of these classic African easterly waves. So that's a typical sign of an active season. We're not getting like high latitude. We're getting a lot of high latitude storms, but those aren't the hurricanes. So from that perspective, that's a sign of an active season, is the waves becoming hurricanes. But I really thought we'd get stuff forming farther east.
Yeah, it seems like when we do these seasonal predictions, right, we don't talk about where they're going to develop. We kind of just think about storm activity in general for the entire basin. But as you mentioned, it's been a challenge for these storms to develop over the central and eastern main development region close to Africa.
And it's been interesting because normally kind of the bane of a hurricane is too much westerly shear. You get westerly, so shear out of the west, the hurricane's plowing into it and it just doesn't, or the storm's plowing it doesn't get going. We've had a lot of easterly shear this year, which is actually, it's kind of almost like, normally it's like you want easterly shear anomalies because it counteracts the westerly shear and you reduces it. But this year it's almost been a little too much easterly shear. Even in the case of, especially in the Caribbean, there's been a lot of easterly shear. So maybe with time, that will actually turn around. I know Bill Gray said, especially 1988, that was one of the things that kind of held 88 back from getting going, was that there was actually too much easterly shear at the start of the season, and then that eventually waned, and then they got Hurricane Gilbert, which was quite the impressive Cat 5 hurricane. So yeah, it's been an interesting year. That's, I think, the thing that's been most surprising is that we haven't seen as much coming off Africa. Now, I'd be completely dumbfounded if we don't see something forming east of 45 west in the next 7 days. I suspect we'll get at least one, if not 2 storms, maybe 3 or maybe 4, depending on which model. So I think we're going to see some really interesting vortex interactions here coming up. There's a lot of stuff out in the Atlantic. It's just the flow is really stagnant, so stuff really isn't moving that much. So if you pick a particular vortex, it might be at 30 degrees west now, and maybe in 10 days be at 50 west. So it's going to be really interesting to see what comes out in the next 2 weeks. And it was a really tricky ACE forecast, and Mike and I had an email chat about this earlier, is that, we don't, right now we have Nana, which is going to make landfall tomorrow. So we kind of know how much ACE that's going to bring. Omar is going to bring very little. And then we still have like 30 ACE left to make the above average category. And I suspect these storms will get going, but it's tough if they don't get going for a week, to get 30 ACE is a lot. You got to get these storms ramped up and get them up to hurricane strength get a lot of ace generated. So it may be tricky to get the 34 ace. But it's always it's a little hard. I basically just looked and said, okay, the large scale still looks pretty conducive overall. There's a lot of stuff coming off Africa. Trying to basically count the ace from the models can be just a messy exercise, and probably not really. That really shouldn't be what I'm doing for a 2-week forecast, is just trying to estimate model generated ace, because anybody, you can just spit that out. You figure you got to use the large scale, and the model volatility run to run has been huge. And so, my wife's always yelling at me to stop looking at the models constantly, because, it just drives you insane.
Well, it's kind of similar, like with the volatility. It just reminds me of the Boston Red Sox over the last 5 to 10 years. Just one year they're the champions, and next year they're the worst team in baseball. So it just, they flop more than the GFS, it seems. But
I know, yeah. This year hasn't been particularly pretty. I think they kind of like, so while I worked for CSU, lived in the Bay Area, kind of like the Golden State Warriors are probably happy in a way, kind of happy they had a really crappy year this year, because they don't have to deal with the bubble and all that stuff. Yeah. I think the Red Sox, kind of maybe didn't think the season was going to happen this year, and they didn't get the memo that they're actually going to play baseball, because it's been it's kind of bringing back not so fuzzy memories of the Bobby Valentine era.
Oh, it's a very convenient excuse there not to expect a season to happen and just stink it up. So they're going for draft.
Yeah, well, at least they can't. At least they don't have to. At least 35,000 to 40,000 fans at Fenway Park are having to watch this every night.
Well, you know what? I always living in Boston now as a New York Yankees fan, I tend to love these years for a number of reasons. That when the Red Sox are just horrible, and that's because the ticket prices are so low. The Red Sox fans, they're so intense with the sports, or I'm sorry, just Boston fans in general. Just so entwined in their sports that when their team is so bad, they don't support them at all. They're just like, I'm done. I can't watch them. It hurts too much. That's when I step in. I get a ticket for $5 and sit anywhere I want behind. I go up to home plate. No one cares. So I think I probably saw maybe 15 games in one of the years the Red Sox were so bad. I spent probably $100 to see those games. It was crazy. So I like them for multiple reasons.
Yeah. This would be a good year to get cheap tickets if you could actually go to the game.
Yeah, unfortunate of COVID, and whoever's on the stream, we're hoping that you guys are handling the COVID situation well and everyone's safe from the pandemic. So, okay, Phil, let's take a walk through your forecast here. So I'm actually I've been sharing my screen of some weather stuff while we're talking. You can't see it, but the guys on the
I've been seeing and looking at stuff. I know if you're looking at the latest GFS to see how many vortices it's spinning up.
Well, I was showing a GFS forecast with the dynamic tropopause map, showing the 3 storms that the model is potentially spinning up, but there is an upper level low out there that is going to start to move. These storms track northwestward. There's a possible interaction with that feature, which could hurt some of the intensity of those storms or stunt genesis. So that's something that we're going to keep an eye on. Maybe one factor of why the models are struggling with genesis there. But looking at your latest forecast here, I have it up on the screen. You are calling for the next 2 weeks to be characterized by above normal activity, which is greater than 34 ACE units. So do you want to discuss some of the things that went into your forecast here for the next upcoming few weeks here?
Yeah, and first of all, I know ACE is very kind of something probably people have a hard time kind of figuring out, but basically an easy way to think of it is if you have a storm, so it's all these things are calculated off of knots, which is 1.15 miles per hour. So basically, if you have a major hurricane, 100 knot major hurricane, so 115 mile an hour major hurricane, that generates 4 ACE per day. Then it's a major hurricane. If you have a Cat 5, it generates 10 ACE per day. So if you get a Cat 5 hurricane, ACE goes through the roof. Whereas if you have weak, junky pieces of garbage, a 60 mile an hour tropical storm generates 1 ACE per day. And Cat 1 hurricane's about 2, Cat 2 is about 3. So basically, the ACE goes up exponentially as your storms get higher and higher. So to get 34 ACE, you're going to need to have a major hurricane in there somewhere. And so it kind of remains to be seen. As we talked about, there's been kind of a pernicious upper level feature that's been kind of shearing stuff off in the central Atlantic. And so it's tricky. It's how these things play out with that, if they all kind of just run into it, if something can one take it for the team and kind of interact with it and kind of move it out so the other ones can get underneath it or whatever. So it kind of remains to be seen exactly how that's going to play out. Mm-hmm. And I think it really is critical for hinging on how much ACE the next 2 weeks bring, and probably actually, frankly, how well the seasonal forecast ends up verifying, because the next 2 weeks look pretty favorable.
Yeah.
But then after that, potentially late September, not looking as favorable as the kind of the convective suppressed phase of the MJ will come through. It should probably increase this year. And then probably once you get in October, things looking much more conducive again. But once you get to October, you can still get major hurricanes, but usually not massive ACE generators because they typically only form in the Western Atlantic. And so there's only so far they can go before they go into the mid-latitudes and die. Although every now and then you can still get storms doing odd things in October that can generate huge amounts of ACE. So but definitely I think the next 2 weeks are kind of make it or break it. If we're going to hit 200 ACE the next 2 weeks, one of these suckers has to go and become a big storm. In terms of if anything actually tracks all the way across to the U.S. right now, it seems like that's pretty unlikely. But it's really hard to know. Being beyond, I would say certainly this weekend the odds of the U.S. being impacted by anything are pretty small. But beyond that, once you get beyond about 7 to 10 days, and you never know if you get stuff. Sometimes stuff blows up in the Gulf of Mexico too that we don't necessarily see. So there's been hints on and off of that. Models always bounce around with Gulf of Mexico stuff too. So definitely, it's the peak of the season. So my best estimate is we're probably going to get at least 3 storms in the next 2 weeks, maybe another one. And then usually you kind of get a couple that you see from the models. And there's probably one that you might not see from the models because it may be 10 days out. And then there's probably also some random thing that's going to form that you don't even know about, especially this year. We're seeing like we're getting a lot of kind of these random weird things popping up all over the place. So off and off the U.S. East Coast this time of year, you can get stuff spinning up off the coast of North Carolina, like we've seen with Kyle and then with Omar. And then sometimes you get stuff in the Gulf of Mexico, Bay of Campeche. So a lot of areas to potentially watch, but we'll see what transpires in the out of this stuff coming out of the Eastern Atlantic. But yeah, it's tough. It's going to be it's not a slam dunk forecast one way or the other. So we'll see. I'd be shocked to see it verified below average. Yeah. But to get the 34 ACE, one of these, we can't, 3 week storms isn't going to generate it. You need to get something that becomes a major hurricane, most likely, unless you get, I guess if you got 3 Cat 2s, you might get it, but probably going to need to get at least one major hurricane to be a major hurricane for several days. But if we ended up September 15th with only one major hurricane this year, that would be pretty surprising. I think everyone doing seasonal forecasts would be surprised if we made it halfway through the season and we had one major hurricane.
Right. I think one of the reasons why you alluded to the fact that if we do get an uptick in activity over the Atlantic Basin, you feel less concerned about a U.S. strike, though obviously things can still change, but because of the extratropical pattern, right? We're seeing, a huge Rossby wave dispersion from the Pacific Basin from those typhoons that are moving up into the higher latitudes, predicted to have an interaction with the Pacific jet stream, which then amplifies the downstream pattern. And the models are showing a fairly large amplified western U.S. ridge, which is going to bring you some pretty anomalous warm days out in the Pacific Northwest here in the Western California, Northern California, where you are right now. And you're dealing with forest fires. We talked about it before the stream started and how there's been smoky out there. So, it doesn't look like good weather to fix that problem right now. But what's going to happen with the big western U.S. ridge is it's going to produce this pretty robust trough that, digs down across the east. And, those troughs, when you get like a eastern U.S. trough during an active hurricane season, you typically get these like recurvature of storms out over the Atlantic Sea because of the way that the steering flow sets up. So, and that's what it seems like, I think that's where you're heading towards, like this idea of potentially if there isn't burst in activity, you feel less concerned at this point than normal because of that pattern.
Correct. Yeah, at least for the next 10 days. And again, the models don't always do a great job with the typhoon recurvature and exactly how that's going to end up being. But yeah, at least early on, it looks like probably nothing headed to the U.S. at least for the next 10 days or so. But again, once you get beyond that, it's hard to know. If you look at all the EC ensemble members, they do have a few things sneaking through. So it just kind of depends on how things shake out. But to me, the best case in point of that pattern is 2010, where we had 12 hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin and not one hit the U.S. Obviously, this year we haven't been very good at all. We got 4 hurricanes and 3 have hit the U.S. Yeah. The fourth one, Marco, really, really fizzled across the finish line, barely made it.
Thank God.
Yeah, thankfully. But, we were 3 for 4, 4 hurricanes in the Atlantic Basin, 3 have hit the U.S. And frankly, also too, obviously Laura was rapidly intensifying and kind of basically kind of flattened out. Basically, it was kind of stabilizing at a Cat 4 strength when it made landfall. But then you had Hannah, which was intensifying pretty quickly as it came ashore. And I think if it had been over water a few more hours, that sucker could have been. And same with ECE. I think both of those storms had they been over water for another 12 to 24 hours, we could have potentially had 3 major hurricanes hitting the U.S. already, because Hannah, the pressure was dropping fast.
Yeah, it was. It ran out of time. It ran out of time of ocean. Yeah, and it got lucky there with that one.
So those,
I was to say, I know with Laura that when it was a Cat 4, it was like on the upper echelon of Cat 4, so it was a damaging storm. It was nearly $9 billion of loss, or economic costs, over 50 fatalities when looking at it.
Yeah, it was a nasty storm, and thank God almost all the storm surge went into the bayous, because it had that storm. So basically, like, you watched Laura, and the forecast, the where it made landfall was about 20 miles farther east than where NHC was forecasting, like 12 hours ahead of landfall. And that 20 miles basically made the difference between 9-12 feet of storm surge into Lake Charles, as opposed to further east, where thankfully almost nobody lives. And so if you look, some of the high water marks are starting to come in, and they're coming in at 15, 17, maybe even 18 feet. Because originally it was like, well, there was no surge. It's like, well, there was surge. We just weren't there to observe it. And so you start getting some of these gauges and some of these things that were, maybe the power had been out, or you look at some of like the Army gauges, you start seeing some pretty impressive surges from Laura. So the surge was there. Thankfully, it just went into an area where not many people live. So from that perspective, it was good. But obviously the wind damage was
immense,
immense, which you would expect from a Cat 4 hurricane.
Right, 150 mile per hour winds.
Yeah.
So we're moving into the September 2nd, 15th, and you tweeted out an image today. So for anyone who wants a good follow on statistics of hurricane season, Phil is by far the best out there, at Phil Klotzbach on social media, on Twitter. But you did tweet out this image and showing the locations of Genesis spots over the Atlantic Basin for the upcoming 2 weeks. And it looks like the Atlantic Basin is pretty much wide open climatologically at this time, right?
Yeah, I mean, climatologically, the climatological peak day is September 10th. It's kind of the historical climatological peak of the season. And the Atlantic season is very, very peaked. So when you're putting out a seasonal forecast, like, these 2 weeks can basically make or break your season effectively, because this is when the stuff really, really is peaked in the Atlantic. And so if you look at ACE, while the Western North Pacific historically generates 2.5 times, 3 times as much ACE as the Atlantic in a season, if you plot the daily ACE generated, the Atlantic actually generates more ACE even in the Western North Pacific for about 2 weeks at the climatological peak. So the Atlantic goes gangbusters in early to late September, and then it comes down pretty quickly. And so there's kind of the perfect intersection between, so vertical wind shear in the Atlantic tends to be at its lowest in about late August, but the sea surface temperatures continue to warm even up into early October. So it's kind of that perfect intersection of low shear, still low, but the sea surface temperatures warming up. Usually climatologically, this is late August is when you really stop getting the African easterly, or you stop getting all the big dust outbreaks off of Africa. The Saharan air layer tends to effectively not dry out, but it tends to effectively become less of an issue. Usually the upper tropospheric trough that kind of hangs out in the central Atlantic tends to lift further north that time of year too. So it kind of opens up that whole beltway. But then by the time you get to late September, you start getting more frontal intrusions. The shear really kicks up, especially in the eastern Atlantic. So you don't really tend to get, you'll still get waves that will develop, but they tend to develop closer to the Caribbean. You don't get as much stuff forming at 20, 30, 40 degrees west. It tends to more form right near the Caribbean.
Yeah, we also see some pretty big changes in the West African monsoon as we get into the September timeframe, right? Like, if you look at just a daily progression of rainfall from like a latitude by time perspective, you typically see like this pretty quick jump or pretty gradual increase of rainfall as it goes from south to north, as your ITZZ location lifts northward with the time of year, and it peaks around like August, early September. So Africa is primed right now. At least climatologically, we're at the peak here for getting these waves to spit off. But then as you move into the later part of the month, and especially October, your ITCZ shifts further south. You don't really get those robust easterly waves coming off Africa. And I think that's another contributing factor there for turning off your Cabo Verde systems, and everything kind of shifts closer to the U.S.
Yeah, because the Africa, you start getting easterly waves even as early as June, but typically in June, July, it's just too stable in the eastern Atlantic. It's just dry, it's stable. So these things will be coming off, but they don't really do anything. And so, there's about 60 to 70 waves that come off of Africa each year. And thankfully, we don't get 70 hurricanes each year. But usually during like late August, early September, the percentage of waves coming off Africa that become storms or become hurricanes is pretty high. Yeah. And then if you go earlier, they come off, but they just don't spin up.
Yep.
And so this year we've seen some of these storms spinning up, but they generally spun up further west. We haven't seen a lot of stuff basically like hitting the ground running right off of Africa.
Yep. So we are in peak hurricane season for your report, which I think was a really interesting tidbit there that typically you can get 2 weeks out of the year where the Atlantic has more ACE than the Westpac. I did not know that. And I always wonder when I see your statistics on Twitter, is it coming out of your brain off the fly, or do you have some kind of system where you're crunching numbers and getting it right? How do you do that so quickly? It's really impressive.
It's mostly Excel and Python. So I do a lot of climatological hurricane work. Like a lot of the papers that I publish are based on various landfalling hurricanes, basin-wide stats and seasonal forecasts. We have a lot of stats, and then it's basically just kind of calling through. And then I don't like to be inside. I generally like to be outside. So usually what I will do is kind of look and see records I think might be set, and then basically have notes on my phone and then just tweet stuff out from the trail if I have to, because I don't like to be inside. So
dedication right
and
there.
Especially with the storm like Laura, because I think Laura, I was up for 22 hours straight. Effectively what I did was like a few hours before landfall, wrote down like 15 different things that I thought were going to happen. And then basically like once the storm hit, just do a mass like tweet storm of here's what this did and this did and this did and this did. And we also at the end, usually each year, so for the bulletin of the AMS, they have what's called a state of the climate, which is a report that basically summarizes the global climate, and have a section on the tropics. And there's usually in the Atlantic hurricane season, they usually have a sidebar on a particularly impactful storm. So I usually take a bunch of notes. So for example, hopefully Laura will be our sidebar, that there's not a storm more impactful than Laura. Obviously that remains to be seen, but if not, then I already have the notes from all those records on Twitter that I posted. I can basically write a lot of the sidebar just from that.
Wow, that's really interesting. That's a great way of kind of tackling two problems at the same time. So
yeah. So myself and Ryan Truschel, who went to Florida State now runs Weather Tiger, he and I teamed up on a sidebar on Dorian last year. So we've been bandying some ideas back and forth on Laura. Hopefully, again, Laura will be the one we write on, because there won't be anything else impactful this year. But again, we're still up to the peak of the season, and so kind of the thing I figure is even if we don't end up getting 12 hurricanes and 5 major hurricanes, to the general public in general, it's been a very active season because we already had a landfalling major hurricane. Yeah. And the odds of not hitting the Greek alphabet at 15, all we need is 7 more storms to be into the Greek alphabet, given they don't use Q, U, X, Q, U, X, Y, and Z. They don't use those 5 letters. So we only got to get to 22 storms. So all we need 7 more storms.
It's very
not a certainty, but pretty stinking close that we're going to be in the Greek alphabet by the end of the year.
Yeah. I was going to bring that up to you and ask you what your over/under or what your chance of getting to the Greek alphabet were. I think the last storm is Wilfred. So
yeah. Oh, let me see. I texted Eric Blake, who's at the Hurricane Center. I texted him earlier today to with my updated forecast, and so I said if I had to do another forecast, I said my new seasonal forecast was 35, 9, and 4.
Oh, what? Wait, say it one more time.
It was a little facetious, but I would probably say my overall number of storm forecasts now will probably be like 28, 9, and 4, or 28, 10, and 4. Somewhat dependent on what happens with Nana today.
Right.
I mean, again, we put out the seasonal forecast in August, and that's the last one. And I'm always like agonizing over should I tweak the number, or should I tweak the numbers a bit? But if I had to do a forecast today, I probably would actually increase the number of named storms for the year, because I think 24 is probably may still be under, given the ways things are going, and I suspect we're going to get 3 or 4 storms in the next 2 weeks.
Yep.
But the number of hurricanes of 12, especially if Nana doesn't go, it could happen, but it's going to have to get bonkers active and then have a really active October, November, which I think has the potential. But if you're counting on stuff in late October and November, that's not, that can be a little dicey.
So I was looking at our 4-kilometer version of our graph model, which is a model that we're running at IBM. And, I was watching some of the convection and the model's prediction for particularly Nana, and it shows it, struggling for the next, 10, 12 hours or so. But then as it moves closer to the coast of Belize, it does start to wrap around the convection and start to make it more robust looking. So I can't tell from like the domain view that I was looking at whether or not it's going to like intensify to a hurricane again, or at all. But it seemed like it's getting better organized in that model's prediction before landfall. So that's something that I think is still a possibility for a quick.
Yeah. I mean, these tight systems are always tricky because basically if you give it dry air, shear, it can fizzle really quick. But the second it gets in a better environment or a more consistent environment, these suckers can blow up really, really fast. So these tight little storms, I think your margin of error can be really high.
Definitely. And you have to resolve it.
I haven't seen what the latest. I mean, I saw there was a big blow up of convection. It looks like it's still kind of blowing up. Sorry, I'm also pulling up the stuff as we talk. But yeah, it looks like there's a pretty healthy ball of convection over there now. It looks like it's definitely still battling some northerly shear, but it's got kind of a nice tight little convection. So I think they have a plane. A plane heading into it now. So I should give a shout out. I use it all the time. Big Cowan, for aircraft reconnaissance, he has by far the best visualization of aircraft reconnaissance. Because if you look at what visualization of the flight level winds, the satellite image where the plane is relationship to the storm, and it's all the wind bars, circulation is closed, and so I was at recon with Nana, and I saw like 60 knot flight level winds, but then also saw the you can actually see like the wind barbs. You could tell it actually had a certain minutes or half an hour, 45 minutes. The sucker is getting named. So Nana, I think, was the shortest potential tropical cyclone on record. Went from potential to tropical cyclone in like 45 minutes or something.
And that is the beauty of recon. So for the Twitch stream, I am showing that 4 kilometer graph model. So Phil, I'm sorry I can't show you, but I you can see that there's some curvature bands in the model. It almost indicates somewhat of an eye wall feature trying to spin it up. The model's trying to spin it up before landfalling. So I think we still have a chance of getting there for that as a possible hurricane. But it's obviously, again, we're at the mercies of the models here when we're talking about intensification, and we know the models do a very bad job of it. So it's a tough game when we get into like whether or not a storm that's bearing down on land, it's going to rapidly intensify into something or spin down. It's just tough to get those intensity fluctuations. So.
Yeah, I just took a quick look at the ship's output. It does look like the shear is going to stay fairly constant. But it looks like it's going to be slightly moister as it goes in. So the thing with shear is that not only is shear kind of tilts the vortex, but it also can promote dry air entrainment. And that was always one of Bill Gray's big things was entrainment of dry air in a tropical cyclones is good for people in the path, but bad for the hurricane because it basically the entrained dry air, it basically promotes downdrafts, suppresses updrafts, and really chokes out thunderstorm activity. You could see it even with Nana, where it had all this blossoming convection, and then suddenly it was kind of fizzled. It all just fizzled because it ingested a bunch of dry air. And especially when it's a big sprawling system, it can handle dry air a lot better than if it's a tight little system. Those ones they can blow up really quick, they can intensify quickly, but they can also weaken pretty quickly if they get in an environment that's nastier.
Yep. So we are about 5 minutes here from the top of the hour, and I usually keep these things kind of limited to an hour just because, whoever does get that hour lunch break here on the East Coast, I know it's time to go back to work like me. So I do want to go to this the chat that this Twitch has a chat feature.
Sure.
And there's some people that ask some questions. So I want to bring these questions to you, Phil, and see what your response is here. So we have someone.
All right.
Ador, they are happy to see weather live. First question here is about the MJO forecast.
Okay.
And I noticed you had this in your section as well, and you just kind of mentioned it briefly, but why don't you give us a quick update about the MJO and what you expect it to do here in the coming weeks?
Yeah, so the MJO actually propagated through what's generally considered the most favorable Atlantic phases, which both I showed for a lot of my work and Mike did for his PhD stuff too, kind of basically showing that phases 1 and 2 and into 3 tend to be really conducive for Atlantic hurricanes. And so it's not necessarily so the MJO is basically deep convection that propagates around the globe every 30 to 60 days. And in the Atlantic, you don't actually get your most storm activity when it's enhancing convection more. It's actually more the changes in the lower and upper level winds. So it basically, when you enhance convection over Africa and Indian Ocean, that's when the Atlantic tends to giddy up because you knock down your shear. And I mean, Bill Gray always looked at upper level winds. That was his big thing. And basically, if you have upper level, so if you have convection over Africa, you have upward motion over Africa. Basically, the divergence from that upper level, from that increased convection, is going to cause upper level easterly flow, which basically knocks down your normal westerly winds in the Atlantic. So typically, when you have, and the other thing I would look for too is subsidence over the tropical Pacific. Like, if NHC has zero tropical weathers, any areas in the East Pac for 5 days, that's usually a sign the Atlantic's probably going to pick up too. So some of the reason I think the last couple of weeks have been a little bit not necessarily, I mean, it's hard to say it wasn't active because we had a Cat 4 hurricane hit the U.S., but it didn't generate maybe as much ACE as we thought, is that the East Pac was still kind of churning out some storms. And I think if you look at 2017 and you look at, say, velocity potential, which is something I know Mike likes a lot, and basically it's kind of it's a nice smooth field, and basically it's like where's air going up and where's air going down effectively. And 2017 September, which was like carnage bonkers, was basically suppressed convection like crazy in the tropical Pacific. And that's really what we're going to see for the next couple of weeks. And it remains to be seen kind of how that's going to continue to go. And so if you look at the subseasonal, the MJO right now is, I believe, officially in phase 3, and it's forecast to kind of go into phase 4, which is more over the maritime continent, which is when the Atlantic tends to start to actually not be quite as conducive. But it then looks like the MJO index, at least the index, official index, is kind of tank and basically go near zero, meaning not much amplitude. And so some of that's probably a bit of the long-term trend towards La Nina, where you tend to get more suppressed convection over the tropical Pacific. But it remains to be seen. Sometimes MJOs typically initiate over Indian Ocean, and then sometimes they just get a tropical Pacific and then fizzle. And so it kind of remains to be seen exactly, is this sucker going to continue propagating? Because we actually had a nice, clear propagation of the MJO all the way around the globe, which doesn't necessarily happen a ton in the summer, but we did actually get a pretty nice, good, complete loop around the MJO circle. And so, yeah, it kind of remains to be seen how that's all going to end up playing out. But at least for the next 10 days, 2 weeks, it looks like it'll still be pretty conducive in the Atlantic. Again, if you have air going up over Africa and Indian Ocean and air sinking over the Pacific, that's usually when the Atlantic tends to be active. And it reduces your shear and also tends to give your monsoon a bit of a boost. And African monsoon this year has been pretty amped. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't have like a monsoon index, but I would assume it's got to be close to at least top 5. It's been a lot of upward motion, a lot of rain in the Sahel region, which is one of Bill Gray's classic historical predictors. But sorry, I digress. I'm sure Mike and I, we can talk hurricanes for the next 6 hours. So
yeah,
we could. I'd try to answer one more question, and I know it's already been almost an hour. So
no, it's all good. And thanks for the subscription there, Renee. Appreciate it. Thanks for joining the channel here. I actually am sharing a Hofmüller diagram, a time longitude plot of velocity potential anomalies with the CFS V2 forecast attached to it to give us an idea of the MJO over the next 6 weeks. And as you mentioned, this last MJO event made it around the world. It was more, you could see it more clearly in the upper level velocity potential anomaly field, as you typically do. Convection, pretty much, the convection will form and be present and viewable in locations where convection is most favorable, over the warm pools and usually over land masses. But, if you look at upper level winds, you see the signature of like an MJO or Kelvin wave. You can make it multiple circuits around the world. It kind of goes into the hand-in-hand theory of Kelvin waves being non-dispersive. So this particular event is making another round across the Indian Ocean, Western Pacific, and it does show, the CFS at least shows it continuing across the Pacific again in the latter half of September in the front half of October, which goes hand in hand to what you were talking about potentially, second half of September and early October, maybe being a little bit less active compared to normal. But then as that active MJO moves back around again, the Western Hemisphere, that's where we could see another round of activity. It's probably more closer to the U.S. rather than these Cabo Verde systems. But just to buyer beware, in the CFS forecast, as the CFS typically does for the MJO, it's too slow with its eastward propagation. So, and we're seeing that again in the CFS today in the model. So I kind of like the idea here that, maybe we get into like the first week of October, we could start to see the Atlantic Basin transition back into another state that might be a little bit more conducive for development once this suppressed MJO comes through, and then we have to wait for things to kind of clear out again. So I think, Phil, you talked about that, and it's funny you mentioned the and we're going a little late here, but you're funny that you mentioned the African signal's been so, the seasonal state's been so robust this year. And if you do a low pass filter on velocity potential, you can see that there's a nice standing wave right over Africa and over the Western Indian Ocean. That's a prime state for a very strong West African monsoon, and this is the strongest, I think, on record that we've seen this atmospheric standing wave. So there's no reason, there's no doubt in my mind that Africa has had a very wet summer so far, and it's good because they need the rainfall. They depend on agriculture there on that rainfall. So, but it all ties in again to these seedlings coming off of Africa here, and I do think that, as you mentioned earlier, we should get a few more storms here in the coming 1 to 2 weeks, maybe go through another lull here at the end of September, and then maybe come back again in that October timeframe. And I think that's where your forecasts are going to be heading towards too, right?
Yeah. And I mean, I feel like, again, the 2 week forecast in terms of the ACE, especially, and major hurricanes, I mean, we forecast 5 major hurricanes. If we don't have 2 more major hurricanes by September 20th, then it could be dodgy to get to 5. I mean, you can get 2 in October and you can get them in November even, but it would still be, given how conducive the monsoon has been and just overall the large scale has been, I'd still be shocked if we don't end up with maybe not an ACE of 200, but an ACE of like 150. And again, trying to count ACE from what's spinning off there now, I suspect one of these things is at least going to make a run for it. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. The models have been really abysmal at forecasting this stuff, and I think what we talked about earlier, it's just a really complicated setup, and there's a lot of stuff out there. So how this all plays out, I think, is going to be interesting. But the good news is we don't have to wait that long. We can wait a couple weeks and we'll see how it pans out. And then you never know. Just because even if the conditions get less conducive in September, you never know what can transpire.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily suppress everything everywhere. And sometimes, too, then you get higher latitude stuff that can spin up.
Yeah, so
on occasion, those higher latitude storms can generate a heck of a lot of ACE. Leslie was a classic case in point of that, of like just this obnoxious storm that spun out in the Atlantic Ocean for like 3 weeks. And Eric Blake and I talked about this. It almost hit for the tropical cyclone cycle. It was a subtropical depression. It was a subtropical depression, a subtropical storm, a tropical storm, and a hurricane. It didn't hit major. It almost hit major hurricane, missed major hurricane, and it also missed tropical depression. But it was close to hitting for the cycle of every classification the Hurricane Center has.
You are bringing me back to bad memories of Nadine. When I was
Nadine killed my 2012 forecast. Our 2012 forecast was looking good, and it was like that thing just was out there forever, and like it died, and then it was like 12 hours later, it was like, oh crap, it's coming back. It just kept spinning and spinning. So you never know. So those are other good examples of noise in the seasonal forecast.
Right.
So,
and when the time of Nadine was happening, I was part of the NASA HS3 forecast. They were doing a field campaign, flying Global Hawks into hurricanes, and literally my entire stint on Wallops Island, Virginia, helping out with this program was freaking Nadine, just the Nadine show. It was. I have bad memories of that storm all over again. I don't want to deal with it. I'm sorry it ruined your forecast. That's really interesting to know because I hate to. So
yeah. So sometimes those storms can build. It depends on your forecast. Sometimes you're rooting for Nadines and Leslies, and other times you're not, depending on what you're forecasting. So at the end of the day, we'll see what transpires. But I think all in all, certainly we're going to be odds of Greek alphabet. I'd say are extremely high, since that's almost shooting fish in a barrel. 7 more storms at this point.
Yeah.
In terms of getting above normal hurricane and major hurricane activity, I think is still high. In terms of hitting 200 ACE, that's going to take the next 2 weeks hitting the forecast and then some. So we'll see what transpires.
All right. So that's the. Hey, thanks so much for joining the stream. I really appreciate it. No viewers here are really happy and excited that you came on. So it's been fun catching up with you. It's been a while since we've seen each other. We typically try to today messes and all that, and I don't. It's been tough. So hopefully in the coming 1 or 2 years here, we'll be able to get back together here and see each other again. So
yes, definitely. Sounds good. Hey, great chatting with you all. Nice to meet or nice to see everyone else virtually too.
All right. Thanks, Phil. And thanks everyone for joining the stream. I appreciate everyone. Take care, guys.